sophistication and operations and what the Persians are doing in this conquest of Greece, which is something that they might have done in Egypt too earlier, but this is where you really get a chance to see it on display, is a precursor to, land sea operations today involving, marine, amphibious landings, everything. These fleets can be used to sit offshore and follow an army that's marching along the coast and feed it. Extending operations. Nobody knows how many troops Mardonius had, but he lands in this area controlled by Thracians. The entire region around the Balkans during this time period, and this particular area, of course, is up in sort of by where modern northeastern tip of Greece is, up in that area, all a bunch of Thracian tribes. Herodotus labeled them the second most populous nation in the world after the Indians, and extremely warlike. He said that they would have conquered the world if they didn't love fighting each other too much. And they are, you don't want to be so stereotypical about barbarians, because all these people had wonderful cultures and values and religious beliefs and puberty rights. I mean, it's all a part of it, but you can't help but look at a Thracian and think there's your Hollywood casting director's idea of a barbarian. They look a lot like a Scythian without the horse. They got the war paint, they got the tattoos, they like to, carry severed heads around with them when they're trying to intimidate their enemies, and they're tough. And they like ambushes, and they like to kill prisoners. I mean, they scare people. And this area had submitted to Darius, this whole area, when he came along chasing those Scythians a while back. But, the Persian army then goes home, and they kind of, get a little lax, and we haven't heard from him in a while, and, whatever. And then the army comes back and says, we're just going to tighten that relationship a little bit more, and made all of those areas that had been formerly sort of just, we're your vassals kind of deal, into official provinces run by governors appointed by the Persian king. One of these provinces is the next little kingdom, I guess you could say, on the way to Greece. So you go from Thrace to Macedonia. If the name rings a bell, the king at the time will, ring it even harder. His name is Alexander the First of Macedonia. Do you know what he does when the Persian army under Mardonius shows up? He submits. Becomes a governor under the control of the Persians, and some historians, in a wonderful, ironic twist of history, say that if not for the stability and centralization and state-building climate that Persian control, gave Macedonia during this period, they may never have coalesced into a strong centralized state that would eventually evolve into something that could destroy the very people who made that centralized state possible. Oh, and just for the fun of it, do it under a king with the same name. Don't you just love history? Nonetheless, the Thracian tribes do get one good sucker punch in on Mardonius before they get crushed brutally. A tribe of them will ambush the Persian army at night and create great havoc, including wounding Mardonius. Right around the same time, this fleet that is accompanying the Persian army will try to round a point called
Hey man, I just started streaming. Thank you. It's in the early phase. It's in the early phase of process. Though this is not my voice, that was Dan Carlin, the historian from his channel. I am just started to paint this map, to just finish this line art, and then there's a lot of work to do here. So it's gonna be a marathon of illustration, really. I'm gonna sink huge amount of hours in this one. Oh, nice. What's the genre of the game?
Taman ti je to u skladu sa fakultetom. Konačno. Pa ne znam, to ne razumem se to neka poznata firma, šta je? Velike, malo. Aha.
Just put on some music. Puzzle adventure and it's underwater. Oh, nice, nice. That sounds great.
Dve fabrike imaju i to bi vodio, jel?
Sorry for the background voices.
Pa to.
I'm doing the stream in the living room, so
Pa je ti to zanimljivo? Aha, kancelariju su šok.
okay. Put some music on. I'm just gonna lower this, and if the music is too loud, feel free to comment. Well, eventually I will move to my little studio downstairs, but I have to invest some time in restoring it, you know. It's gonna be next year, I think. So you're a game developer. You're doing all stuff, or just an art, or programming, or game dev, fairly new. I do art as well now. Oh, the jack of all spades. Nice, nice. That's good, you know. It's good when person goes through every aspect of developing. At least, even if you will not do it in the future, it's good to know the role of an artist in this, such as the artist should know the role of the programmer a bit more. I know a few things about Unity. I focus on the art stuff and animation, but it's good to know, you know, all the aspects for yourself, because you can communicate better with the rest of the development team that way. Where are you from? Yeah, heart is pretty interesting. I concur. Yeah, it's okay, of course. Whatever makes you feel better. I think I'm having some issues with the connection. Yeah, some issues with the connection, sorry. It must be the internet or something. So what did you say? Puzzle adventure, and it's underwater. Wow, that's great. A few months ago, my friend asked me to assist him with the art for the for some kind of map travel management, the underwater theme also, but some dystopian thing. I think it was like finding the Atlantis in some dystopian universe or something. But it fell out. I mean, it crashed the entire project, just like every third project that I worked on. So it's hard to be an indie developer anywhere. A lot of time you must sacrifice, and not a lot of people are prepared to do that. Let's try some windows here.
Šta ti radiš sutra? Ja dolazim u Miami posle posla da posle nekakva banjica slučajeva. Kad si kod kuće? Pa ako hoćeš možda mogu da svratim, bolje nego da se dogovaramo sa još. Da.
Yeah, they do look nice. Yeah, it's some kind of childish thing here. Anyway, here buildings get more human-like, you know, in the architecture, like this, you know, like this here, and like this farm here. But this is some non-human settlement. They are humanoids, but not regular humans. Maybe some beaver people. Who knows? I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. No, this is not gonna be entire game. This is just some art stuff that I'm doing for my portfolio. Just I'm gonna do the assets, the map, some character on the cliff, and parallax effect stuff, and then I'm gonna put it all in the Adobe. Oh, my brain is blocked. Sorry, Adobe After Effects, and then I'm gonna do some video simulation of how this map should look, you know, in game. Gonna throw some random generated name for the game, like I don't know, the Steps of Tom or something. Doesn't matter really. I'm just trying to settle up my ArtStation portfolio to be mainly for the video games and less for the illustrations in the future. So this is the one of the process. I also have some space shooter that I need to finish for portfolio also. So my main focus is art now. Thank you. Yeah, this is mostly my music channel. Recently I started to put some art on it. We have like 2 or 3 maybe videos, maybe even just 2 about art. You have some platformer, side-scroller, level design, level art. You can find it there in the playlist art, I think is the section or something. But anyway, this illustration will not be over soon, because when I finish with these basic colors, I'm gonna do some stylized shadows. Then I need to separate the layers of levels here. You have like platforms that are top, middle, bottom. I need to elevate them with the saturation and brightness, and need to throw a lot of stuff to make this map looks good at the end, but I think it will. It just needs a shit ton of work. But this is gonna be my crown jewel on the portfolio, I think. The crown jewel. Oh yeah, that's how you came on the stream. Nice, nice. Yeah, I plan to stream more often now, especially when I'm doing my own stuff, you know. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna when I finish this map, I'm gonna jump to some symbolism and spirituality. That's the next theme for the stream. So that's like the two main aspects that I'm gonna do in my art and my streams. I'm not trying to do anything serious, considering the stream itself. I'm just like, okay, I'm pumping a lot of hours in this, why not just stream it so some people may watch and hang out. And I don't want to go on Twitch. I did stream on Twitch 2 years before. I don't like the community there, nor the artists, to be honest. But there are some good, how do you say that in English? Good examples. But mostly there are some girls doing some anime stuff that I don't like. I just prefer to see people deliver their own style. Even if it's bad, I respect it more. I respect the individuality in the process, because one thing is to make something good, and the other is to make something unique. You have a shit ton of good artists in the industry now. You can't compete with them, so at least try to deliver your own, you know, spirit in this art. That's like my motto, and it pays out. People like it. People contact me for art assets for their games. It's mostly like indie developers with the, I don't know, side-scroll platformers or something. And that's where this kind of art shines, stylized art. Thank you. Weird woman streamers. Whoa, wrong color. Wrong color, boy. Let's try to cheat this out a little bit, because I'm a bit bored. Oh, you can also up this one. What about this? Oh, nice. You see this? Nope. Good one. Oh, nice. Well, expand. Yeah, welcome back. Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Thank you. I'm gonna put the Dan Carlin back again so we can listen to some history lessons, if that's fine with you. So I'm gonna mute myself and concentrate. Have a good time developing that gem that you are doing.
A point called Mount Athos. And Herodotus says as soon, it's like going around the tip of Florida. Think about it that way. And as soon as the fleet hits the tip, it gets hit by winds. Strong winds, according to Herodotus. And he says 300 ships sank and 20,000 men died. Here's what my Purvis translation of Herodotus says, quote, "From Thasos the fleet crossed over and sailed close to the shore of the mainland up to Acanthos, from which they set out in an attempt to round Mount Athos. But as they were sailing around, a strong north wind came up on them, which was so impossible to deal with that it battered them badly and wrecked many of their ships against the shore of Mount Athos. In fact, it is said that about 300 of their ships were destroyed, with more than 20,000 men. And since this sea is full of savage creatures, some were snatched up and killed by them, while others were dashed against the sharp rocks. Some men perished because they did not know how to swim, and still others died from the cold. So that is what happened to the fleet there." End quote. I'm sorry, in my head right now, I just think to myself, what did that look like? 300 ships? 20,000 men? That's somewhere between 13 and 14 Titanics going down in terms of lives lost, if Herodotus' numbers are anywhere near correct. But even more from a visual standpoint is the idea of 300 ships wrecked. What did that, are they all bunched together in one place, or are they scattered around an entire coastline? What is the visual on this? If Herodotus is doing the movie, who's doing the cinematography on that? And how much do we have to use, CGI computer graphics, because there's no way otherwise to, show that scene? How much would it cost to do that 1950s Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton style, right? Analog. Have to get 300 fake ships. And think about the visuals. It's just all the people in the water. Everything that people find so horrifying about going down in the Titanic, you have happening, around Mount Athos. And, when you think about the precariousness of maritime travel, bad storms will sink ships today, as we all know. Well, the farther back you go in history, in general, the more rickety these vessels become. During this period, they didn't even like to stray away from the coast very much. Standard operating procedure was to beach these ships at night, and then in the morning push them back out. And they're big ships, but you still beach them. 140 guys, I read, it took to essentially lift a trireme onto the shore at night. So I wonder how much it took to actually give these fleets trouble. But the idea of 300 vessels going down when they rounded a cape, it boggles the mind. And yet you can find historical examples all over the place. The most famous has to be the kamikaze, right? The divine wind. When Japan was saved, from the Mongol horde because the storm came up and battered the fleet, sank all these ships, scotched the invasion, right? Maybe this was Greece's own version of a kamikaze. But one thing that the Greeks knew is that this was not going to save them. This kamikaze was not a deliverer, it was a delayer. And in a mere 2 years, Darius will have his next invasion force ready. Understand something, 300 ships lost, 20,000 men lost, that will stop most ancient empires in their tracks. The Persians methodically just put together another one. In 490, it's ready to go, and it is bigger. It is nastier. It is going to be handled better, and we're going to take into account everything we learned from the failures of the last expedition, and this time it is going to be aimed right at the heart of Athens. And it's tempting to see Darius in his CEO role as already seeing that the odds are massively in his favor. I mean, in the celestial casino in the sky, the battle between Athens and the Persians is off the books. They're not taking bets on that. There are no odds. There is no chance. And Darius is still trying to get a little edge here or there. He leaves no stone unturned, planning-wise. He sends out envoys in the year between, the first expedition that founders off the rocks of Mount Athos and the one coming up. He sends envoys to Greece. And they go to all these Greek states and these Greek islands and they ask for earth and water. Remember earlier we said that was the traditional token of submission. And most of these places give it to them. Vast majority of the islands, a bunch of Greek states. Two notable holdouts, though. Athens, who either throws their Persian envoy into a pit that they usually have for convicts awaiting execution or throws them off a cliff. Take your pick. And the Spartans, who in one of the famous moves of all time, although some historians doubt it ever happened, supposedly throw the Persian envoy into a well when he asks for earth and water and tells him he can get both of them down there. That kills the Persian envoy and puts both the Spartans and the Athenians, if they really did that, onto the ledger of, misdemeanors and high crimes that the Persians are keeping track of. Remember what happened to the Egyptians when they killed Persian envoys. Cambyses got to sit there and watch 1,000 or 2,000 of their kids executed and sold into slavery. A bunch of Greek city-states and islands chose what you probably have to see as the only realistic answer and submitted earth and water to the Persians as asked, and instantly becoming not just neutral in this struggle that Athens is about to engage in, but adversaries. I mean, other city-states in Greece all of a sudden were subjects of the great king. That's like the slow-moving lava on the other side of the Aegean all of a sudden launches embers into the sky that drop down on city-states in Greece near Athens. The great king is going to levy troops from these other Greek cities to use against the Athenians. So if you already were going to crush poor little Greece with your Persian forces, well, now he's isolated the Athenians for the most part, the Spartans with them. So now he's just going to crush that little part of Greece. Now he's going to add Greek city-states to his side and their armies to his. I mean, this is a guy who really likes to load the dice, right? And when you hear the scale of this attack and what it takes to launch, it gives you an absolutely new appreciation for the capabilities of ancient peoples. And you really do think to yourself, could we do this today? If we had no computers and none of the modern stuff we normally use? I mean, you try to take, let's just say, a 50,000 stadium-size crowd of people and transport it over water and land a long way and not have it be a catastrophe? Historian Tom Holland, has both of the generals of this expedition. One guy's name is Artaphernes, and he's related to the royal family. The other's called Datus, and he's a Mede, and they command this expedition. And from their eyes, he has them see the preparations that were so large and massive and went on for a whole year, and there's no doubt the Athenians knew this was going on. Holland writes, quote, "Every day's journey westward brought them fresh evidence of the barely believable scale of the great king's resources. The labor gangs toiling to maintain the roads, whole populations sometimes transplanted from the furthest reaches of the earth, the guards stationed beside every bridge, every flotilla of pontoons, every mountain pass, the troops in their own rear, not merely Persians and Medes, but levies drawn from further east, Bactrians, Sogdians, and axe-wielding Saka. What was Athens to people such as these? Not even a name. Yet on they marched, directed by the will of their far-off, all-seeing king, and every evening, no matter where they halted, these men from the steppes, from the mountains, from the villages of Iran, they would be provisioned out of monstrous depots, supplied punctually with jugs of wine and loaves of bread and barley for their horses, And when at last, having passed through the Syrian gates and descended into the plains of Cilicia, on the southeastern coast of modern-day Turkey, they found there waiting for them an immense fleet of ships, some built as weapons of war, others as horse transports. End quote. In the history of naval warfare, what the Persians are about to do here, it's hard to find an earlier version. It's hard to imagine that anyone moved tens of thousands of troops across the water and landed them in like an amphibious assault situation. What the Persians are doing here is breathtaking. And remember, 2 years ago, year and a half ago, 2 years ago, they lost 300 ships and 20,000 men doing something like this. So they know what might happen. This time, by the way, they're going to go a much more direct route. None of this going around the long way and supplying, the army. We're going to transport the army on the ships, and we're going to island hop across the Aegean from Turkey to Greece and take the islands on the way. If you are in Greece, especially if you are in Athens, it's hard to imagine those folks feeling a whole lot different than the British in the Second World War after France fell. And they just knew, okay, brace yourself. I mean, the storm is coming. And for the Athenians, in 490, the storm breaks. In the summer of 490 BCE, the Persian expedition gets underway. Herodotus says it consists of 600 ships. Now, modern-day historians have done a great job poking holes in the ancient authors' numbers, whether we're talking ships or men, but they have no real agreement over what numbers to plug in for them, and there's broad disagreement. In fact, historians are not even sure what the goal of this mission is. Is this a mission just to punish Athens and some of their, small island friends and whatnot? Well, if so, you require, one-size force. If, on the other hand, this is an expedition with the intention to punish Athens and conquer the rest of Greece, you need another size force. So even trying to figure out, your numbers requires you to make certain assumptions, and historians differ. I mentioned earlier that this operation is really a different sort of operation than what you saw before this period. The Persians, as we said, may have done this already a generation before when conquering Egypt. But in earlier periods, you always had naval warfare, but it was something more like a glorified version of what the Vikings did than this. What the Persians are doing is really the precursor, that will eventually evolve into, say, the D-Day landings in June 1944. It's the father and mother of that. Because when the Trojan Wars happen, for example, and the Mycenaeans come over from, the area that's now Greece, and they invade, and you have the Trojan Wars, they come over on ships too. But they don't bring sophisticated horse transports and food-carrying ships that do nothing but bring the supplies that keep everybody fed and watered. That's a modern-day operation. When the sea peoples came to Egypt in ancient times, they didn't bring horse transports and everything they needed to supply an army with them by sea. In 1944, when the Allies crossed the English Channel, they did. And they did here too. By going island hopping when these islands in the Aegean are relatively close to each other, the Persians can avoid having to cross like a large stretch of open water. They can go from place to place to place and, most of the time probably just beach their ships at night. Some cities get the destruction treatment. The first one they go to is one called Naxos, and they owed some payback to that one. And so even though the population fled up into the mountains, places got burned, bad things happened. But then they arrive at another island, one that is supposedly the birthplace of the god Apollo, and the population runs away. They're all scared, and the Persians stop, and they tell them to come back. You have nothing to fear, because that island didn't do anything. They submitted. Then the Persian general goes up to the altar of Apollo and burns an outrageous amount of frankincense, sort of massively over-tipping the god as a kind of a way to say, listen, when we're around, this god's going to get even more than he's used to, when you were taking care of things. I mean, it's the carrot and stick approach that the Persians always use. Then they go to another city, and they rip it to shreds. The city's name was Eretria. It was one of the two cities, along with Athens, that really supported the Ionian revolt. So it's on the hit list for the Persians, and they take advantage of the divisions that seem to be in almost all these Greek cities. Maybe not Sparta, but maybe even Sparta, using their gold, their promises, and this carrot and stick approach of theirs to essentially, tear the Greeks up from within, to exploit divisions that already exist. One of the great advantages the Persians have against the Greeks is they're united and the Greeks aren't. But it's not just a division between this city-state. Argos does not get along with Sparta. It's divisions within city-states. For example, here's how M.A. Dandemiev describes what happens when the Persians launch this expedition to the islands and begin to punish people. Quote, "The Persians disembarked on Naxos, which was still independent. They conquered the island and pillaged it. The majority of the people of the island fled to the mountains. Thereupon the Persian army sailed to the town of Eretria on Euboea. At that time, Eretria suffered from the strong antagonism between two political parties. The aristocrats wanted to defend their town, while the Democrats were inclined to surrender. The Eritreans offered resistance against the Persians for 6 days. On the 7th day, the Democrats surrendered their city, in the hope that the Persians would give them the power over Eretria. The Persians, however, burnt and destroyed the city and its temples, and led away its people into captivity. They were deported to Susa, in modern-day Iran, and thereupon, by orders of Darius, settled in the village of Adurica, in the Elamite district of Kissia." End quote. Supposedly, the great king's orders to his generals had been to reduce Eretria and Athens to slavery, and then to bring the slaves to him. And I kind of always assumed that to be rhetorical. He doesn't mean really like scoop up all the people in this city-state, put them on the ships, send the ships back to the Asian mainland, then march them 3 months to him in chains in Susa, does he? And then I remember that, people have been moving whole populations of other people since time began. If you wanted to, couldn't you look at history through a lens of population movement and start by determining that there's 2 basic kinds? Voluntary population movement and involuntary population movement. The movement of peoples who want to go elsewhere and the movement of peoples that somebody else wants to go elsewhere. Joseph Stalin was doing this kind of stuff in the 1950s, wasn't he? So maybe not that hard to believe. And certainly if you are the Athenians, you get word about this Eritrean disaster, and you get an idea of, what your very near future probably looks like. And you have divisions within your city every bit as contentious as those that brought down Eretria. And you can't help but notice once again that in a very modern move, the Persians are taking advantage of this, with them, leading them, guiding them, and helping them on this expedition towards Athens is a guy that used to run the place. They're bringing back an old tyrant, and I stress the word old because that's what Herodotus does. This is a guy who ruled the place before democracy broke out, and the Persians are bringing him back. They're interested, we would say today, in regime change, and they're bringing a foreign army to back it. But the assumption is that there's going to be a bunch of people in Athens who welcome this, from the other party, if you will. Supposedly there are high signs and all kinds of other things that conspirators and those who want the regime to revert back to the, old days. The city divisions in Athens are clear, they're open, they're talked about by the primary sources, and the Persians appear designing their strategy to take advantage of this. It seems just like them, doesn't it? How are we going to rule this fractious, very political place? Well, let's bring somebody back in who knows the lay of the land and who has the support of a percentage of the people already. And that faction in Athens is opposed by some of the most famous people in this story. If you're looking at it from the traditional Greek point of view, guys like Themistocles, who a lot of historians compare to, a Churchill figure in this story, and another one named Miltiades, who will play a key general role in this upcoming, face-off that we're about to happen. According to Herodotus, it is the former Athenian tyrant in between wheezing and coughing fits that supposedly tells the Persians the best place to land for their amphibious operation. A plain called Marathon, about 25 miles outside the city of Athens. You could call it a staging point for your amphibious operation, right? Unload everything, get yourself all put together, and then you can march on the city. Or you can just act as the incentive for Athens to, take advantage of this. And you can help but notice once again that in a very modern move, the Persians are taking advantage of this. The Persians have been moving whole populations of other people since time began. For Athens to change public opinion, favoring more these people who are saying it would be great to have the old tyrant back, and at the same time we'll be realists about cutting our losses against the great king, who now has an army 25 miles from here, by the way. Did I mention that? War party, Themistocles, Miltiades. What are you going to do about that? And of course, this leads now to a famous encounter. First of all, the Athenians do the smart thing, and they send a runner, which boggles the mind when you think about how this is a life or death issue. Do we send a horseman? No. There had to be a reason why, and I don't know what it is. We'll leave it to a historian to explain why somebody would run to Sparta. But that's what they do. They send a runner because they need help, and who you're going to call. Most of Greece is already working now with the Persians, and besides, the Spartans could kick all their rear ends in combat anyway. Send the runner to the Spartans and begin to put your own house in order and get your soldiers together. And this is where the story once again needs to focus a bit on the soldiers. We described the Persian army earlier, and we pointed out at that time that there's a real importance to things happening on the battlefield level, tactical questions that impact the rest of human history, because remember, this is an encounter that should be off the books at the betting casino, the Celestial Casino. I mean, this is the great Persian Empire encompassing most of Asia, at least the part of Asia that anybody knows about, all the way to India, and Athens. What is going to make resistance anything other than completely futile? Maybe the weapon systems. It's kind of crazy to think about when you realize how long military history has been happening in places like the Middle East, right, or China, or any of those places. They've already got thousands of years of military history under their belt. But in 490, really, this era, right, that we're talking about, BCE, this is the emergence, the beginning, the entrance on the historical stage of European military history. Now, obviously, there's as much European military history as there is anything else. If you can, if we had the tribal records from all the peoples that existed on what's now the European continent going back to 10,000 BCE, but we don't. And historians can try to reconstruct, some sort of dark age or heroic period of Greek history, during the time of the Trojan Wars. But by and large, the first records we have of European armies are these armies we're talking about right now in Greece. The vast majority of them made up of average, everyday folks, dressed and equipped and fighting as heavy infantry. Now, because this is the earliest form of Western military history, you will have whole schools of historical thought, and they were dominant for the last 2,500 years most of the time, that will assert that there are qualities in these Greeks, either what makes them fight or how they fight or their theories behind how you should fight, that have influenced, maybe even made Western militaries dominant for the last 2,500 years. I'm reciting a phrase you might hear from someone from the Victor Davis Hanson school of historical thought on these questions, for example. The idea that the Greeks were people who believed in decisive battle, and that we ourselves are the inheritors in the modern world of that same idea. I mean, it's easy to get lost in the rabbit hole, and I will leave it to the mainstream historians. Hanson's a provocative character, but he gets a lot of pushback, and there's a lot of great arguments for people like yours truly to watch. But part of what makes the ancient period of warfare so fun for a guy like me is that you get to see the most variation between cultures and peoples and societies and their influence on warfare than you see in any other period. I mean, we're very standardized now. If you look at a military from, say, modern-day South America and compare it to one from modern-day Asia, they're going to be dressed the same. They're going to be using the same equipment. They're going to be using very similar tactics. I mean, the difference between the two will be minimal. It's standardized. But the farther back in time you go, especially to the ancient period, all of these cultures are in their most exuberant, shall we say, flamboyant maybe, and distinctive sort of cultural incarnations, for lack of a better phrase. They all look very like their culture. They fight in ways that are connected to their culture, their organization, everything. The contrast is part of what I love about the period. When the Persians and the Greeks first meet in this period that we're talking about right now, this is a clash of cultures, literally. And that's part of what makes this such a rabbit hole of stereotypes and motifs and everything like that to go down, because, it's been this West-East dynamic ever since. But you can't help but notice the wonderful distinctiveness. For example, the Persians are a combined arms army. When we talked about them, you have all these different things you talk about. First, you talk about the cavalry, then you talk about the light troops, then you talk about the line infantry. The Greeks don't have much of that during this time period. They have heavy infantry, hoplites. If you were a war gamer, it's part of what makes Greek armies from this period kind of boring. Everything you get is a hoplite, basically. The hoplite is the quintessentially Greek heavy infantryman. And they're one of the examples that historians often look to try to answer an unanswerable but fascinating question, especially from the pre-gunpowder, period of military history, as to why some people, develop weapons types and weapons systems and soldiery that others can't imitate. I mean, why are there samurai in Japan? Why can't the Chinese emperor just decide one day, those samurai are really badass, I want some samurai, so I'm going to get a disgruntled samurai, bring him over here, let him train my guys, I'll give him the same weapons and armor, and soon I'll have samurai too. Well, you can't do that, can you? There's something cultural, right? The cultural carrots and sticks that are reinforced by the Japanese feudal society that, you can't create samurai just because you want them. In history, when the Roman legionaries were reigning supreme during the Roman Empire period, other commanders tried to imitate that. They're known as imitation legionaries, by the way. Go get a couple of centurions, buy the same armor and weapons, and I'll have legionaries too, but they never quite measured up. You just can't do that. There have to be some of the cultural aspects that are very hard to reproduce. Same thing with hoplites. Historian Victor Davis Hanson gives a remarkable statistic in his writing. He says, quote, "For nearly 300 years, from 650 to 350 BC, no foreign army, despite any numerical superiority, withstood the charge of a Greek phalanx. The battles at Marathon and Plataea demonstrate this clearly. Relatively small numbers of well-led, heavily armed Greeks had little difficulty in breaking right through the hordes of their more lightly equipped and less cohesively ranked adversaries from the east." End quote. Why? This is a fascinating question to ponder, and it goes down roads that are unquantifiable and unmeasurable. When you start getting into questions of things like toughness, how on earth does one measure toughness, and how is toughness infused? If you could take all the children from a so-called tough civilization and transfer them to the parents from a so-called weak civilization, whatever tough and weak mean in a military sense, and take the children from the weak civilization and give them all to the parents of the tough generation, a generation from then, do you change the power relationships at all? Does the weak civilization stay weak, or does it get tough, and vice versa? And then why? I mean, what is toughness anyway? What the heck is this dominance that these hoplites have? Or could it be something that's simply based on, the way they fight? I mean, their formations and their weapons and stuff like that. This is the stuff that historians argue about. Victor Davis Hanson probably is the leading proponent of what maybe you could call the traditionalist approach to thinking about hoplites as, he calls them at one point in one of his books, I love the way he phrased it. He called them heavily armed and armored farmers. And each city-state is a little like a sports team, and they all have personalities. I mean, if you think of the Pittsburgh Steelers as tough blue-collar, guys, and that's reflected in the way that they play and the toughness of their teams, it's a little like, you have Thebes, the city-state of rustic farmers, and they're known to be kind of brawny because they're always out there farming, but they're a little rustic. I mean, every city-state had sort of its own kind of reputation and record versus, traditional opponents. How are the Spartans doing against the Argives? And some of these city-states were considered to be tougher than others. But according to the traditional approach, most hoplite armies are militias. They're the citizens of the city-state, usually just a percentage of them, but as Hansen points out, About 80% of most of these city-states were made up of farmers or people who made money in farming. Athens and Sparta are always kind of exceptions to the city-state rule, by the way. Athens is kind of the New York City or the Paris or the London of ancient Greece. It's a little bit more chic, a little bit more gossipy, a little bit more gossamer, into the theater and the latest trends, and very glib, politically speaking. Talented, funny, humorous, wonderful entertainers. And the Spartans are a laboratory experiment. I love these things where you use human beings as the guinea pigs on whether or not you can create a soldier, that's extra special if all the societal carrots and sticks are arranged correctly. When I was growing up, there was a ton of admiration for Sparta and their system and everything. Nowadays, even conservative historians are much more hard on the Spartan system than they used to be. I mean, Victor Davis Hanson himself will say about Sparta, quote, Sparta's closed militaristic society produced an army of professionals, immune from pressing economic or other peacetime obligations. They were free to threaten the farms of others, to fight year-round if need be, secure in the knowledge that in their nightmarish system of apartheid, servants were busy with their own harvests. End quote. Now, there's all kinds of debate and discussion and disagreement amongst historians about a lot of things. I mean, you have Victor Davis Hanson in one corner. You got a guy like Hans van Wees, for example, in another. And he wrote a fascinating book called Greek Warfare, Myths and Realities that I'm still trying to get my mind around because it's so challenging to traditional beliefs. Doesn't make it true, doesn't make Hanson true. As one reviewer I read said, maybe it's more like something in between the two is true. But van Wees says that everything we know about hoplite warfare comes from a later period than this, 50, 75 years afterwards, and that the armies we're talking about here are much more rustic even than the ones, from classical Greece, as it's called. This is still archaic Greece to him. He says the only reason that the Spartans are considered dangerous at all is because they're the only Greek city-state that prepares for war at all. What's that line, in a world where everyone's blind, the one-eyed man is king? Maybe the Spartans aren't so badass compared to anybody who actually trains for war. That seems heretical. But his point is that if most of these city-states are simply getting all their people together, the ones who fight, the 30 or 40% of the male population out there, free male population that actually fights, when you get them out there, if they're not trained to move as a group, to follow commands and do drills, what are they going to do out there? And von Wees's point is that the Spartans actually did do that drilling, which made them seem almost otherworldly to these armies where, guys just got together one day when needed for war. Imagine, you have a spear and some armor that sits over, your fireplace, and as needed once or twice a year, or maybe once every 2 years, you don the armor, you meet up with everybody in your neighborhood that you normally fight with, and you go out there for the day, and you try to beat the neighboring city-state on a, nice, wonderfully labeled flat field of battle with some certain rules, probably. It's always been believed that these Greeks had rules about, not too many of us are going to use bows or anything like that, right? This is a man-on-man contest, right? In terms of weaponry, the Greek hoplite was a spearman, wielding a 7, 8, 9 foot long, sometimes we even hear of longer, long spear. But that spear was only about an inch thick. It had an iron spearhead and a bronze butt spike on the end. One historian said that was called the lizarder, whatever that means. It sounds awful, the lizarder. And that these troops would form up in very close formation, shoulder to shoulder essentially, with their shield in front and their spears, ahead of them. Now, this means that the spears for about 3 or 4 ranks behind the front rank protrude beyond the front of the formation. So you have a pincushion here. Usually the ones behind that would keep their spears up. The hoplite formation is called a phalanx. We now know, as we didn't maybe 50 years ago or 60 years ago, that the phalanx is a formation that has been used ever since very, very ancient times. Mesopotamian cities were using it a long time ago. But the Greeks may have formed even closer than the norm. It's debated and debatable. The one thing that these formations had a real problem with is any sort of difficult terrain. In fact, maybe even just a little uneven ground, because if you're trying to stay shoulder to shoulder with the person next to you and in front of you and behind you, the last thing you want to do is run into, for example, some bushes. I mean, what does that do to your formation? Victor Davis Hansen's approach to thinking about how this phalanx fought would make it seem something like a very, very, very pointy, irresistible steamroller. And usually they would put the best men in front and oftentimes the best men in the rear file too, and put the least trustworthy, brave, experienced, what have you, men in the middle of the formation, because then there's really no way out. And many of the people who write about the Greek hoplite phalanx and how it fought will point out that it doesn't require a ton of weapons drill. You don't have to really learn how to do much in the way of, the great warrior out there with sword play or using the spear like a Shaolin monk. There's not that kind of thing. You're more of a part of a machine in the phalanx. And the Greek authors and the modern-day historians often say that what seems to be stressed in the sources is much more what we would call today physical fitness, endurance, strength, that kind of thing. And it partially explains why you can have old people fighting in these phalanxes, why everyone doesn't have to be 25 like in today's military. Well, part of it is it's a militia, right? You're supposed to get a cross-section of the public, but also because in a formation like that, older people aren't required to be so nimble. The arthritis, can be more controlled. I mean, you just sort of stay and do your job, stand and die, or, conquer and move forward, but all as a part of this mass working together. In fact, the older people added both experience and solidity. I mean, they had, veteran status, and they could help stiffen some of the younger, newer soldiers in the formation. And some of this is believed by some people to try to explain maybe why these hoplites do so well when they face non-hoplites. I mean, why are they kicking ass? Who knows? Is it the armor? Well, other people have armor. Is it the long spears? Well, anybody could put long spears in the hands of their troops. What makes them do what they do? What makes samurai so good? What makes mounted knights so good? What makes Mongols so good? What makes Apache so good? Hans von Weiss also has another idea about armor and such, and he points out that, well, why don't I let him explain how he sees the development of armor as different from everything we've always learned. Quote, "As scholars have traditionally reconstructed the history of hoplite equipment, it follows in a perfect arc. Beginning in the late 8th century, we witnessed the gradual introduction of hoplite armor, culminating in the universal adoption of the full hoplite panoply in the middle of the 7th century. Then from the middle of the 6th century onwards, parts of the panoply begin to be discarded, until by the end of the 5th century, we reach the rather lightly equipped hoplite already described. This tidy picture needs some modification." End quote. And in his opinion, the artwork is kind of, biased in what it shows, right? The artist wants to show the biggest, baddest guy with the coolest looking armor. Sometimes I'm paraphrasing here, no offense to the historian. But his point is that, when you actually look at archaeological finds and all this other stuff, it's probable that this was always a cost thing. And when you throw people of different wealth classes into a large body of people and tell them to wear their own stuff, this is sort of the hallmark of all of the, city-states except Sparta, is you buy and bring your own kit, right? So everybody's kit's kind of different and personalized, and sometimes they all go down to the neighborhood market and they're selling helmets and they're all alike and we get 5 of the same kind. But if you put all these people together on battle day, it doesn't look very uniform. And because of this, we're told there's even conspicuous display. The rich guys come, and drive up in the BMWs, right? And they have the horsehair crest that's triple and maybe ostrich feathers sticking out too, and the really cool bronze armor that's the latest, the Nimbus 2000 kind of thing. And the poor guy shows up in some leather jerkin or maybe some, thing of linen. They used to think it went from the bronze armor then to the linen armor. It might have just always been a cost question. And the more wealthy the phalanx, members were, the better the armor looked, Well, while the experts may disagree or discuss quite a lot, we'll say, questions of what a hoplite was or how they exactly fought, we can say with a pretty good level of certainty, can't we, that those are the kind of troops, regardless of what they are, that Athens is going to have to rely on if they are going to turn back this Persian amphibious assault we mentioned a little while ago that lands at a place called Marathon, about 25 or so miles outside of Athens. There will be a lively debate in this wonderfully interesting democracy. And Athenian democracy in some ways reminds you a little of the early French Revolution in the sense that they're democratic about like all kinds of things, like they elect generals. And if you believe Herodotus, they elect multiple generals who then have to, share command somehow, maybe by, today's my day, tomorrow's your day. I mean, in that sense, it's a kind of a radical democracy in all kinds of ways. There will be a debate in the city about the best course of action. In dealing with do you give in to the Persians? Is that the realism point of view? Do you fortify the city and stay here, or do you go out and meet them? And eventually, in part led by a guy named Miltiades, we mentioned earlier, they will put together their hoplites and maybe their attendants. A lot of debate over how much the people that actually held the armor for the hoplites, and then once the hoplites were ready to fight, what did those guys do? Did they pick up javelins and fight as light infantry? A lot of debate over that too. But Athens will put together 10 or 11,000 of these citizen militia soldiers who maybe train every now and then as, some sort of yearly event or whatnot, and they certainly would have had experience fighting. But men from different social classes, men from different age brackets, up to, guys in their 40s certainly, and prominent people. There's a lot of prominent people who will forever afterwards remember that they fought in that phalanx that day, and they will take off from Marathon, given that famous order, something to the effect of to take food with them and march, to grab provisions and go. And so this citizen militia of Athens takes off. They're joined by 800 to 1,000 hoplites from the small city-state of Plataea. And then they go and put themselves in a blocking position that keep the Persians from breaking out of their little beachhead area and expanding out into the countryside. And then they sit and hunker down within sight of the Persian army. In this face-off, which goes on for a couple of days, I try to keep reminding myself of the intimidation factor, something that tends to diminish over time. But the Persians in this time period are like the heavyweight champions of the world, and they have a certain aura about them, and Herodotus comments about this. He says that these Athenians camped out there are the first to endure, he says, quote, the sight of the Medes' clothing and the men wearing it. He calls the Persians Medes, and he calls the Greeks Hellenes, and he says, quote, in fact, until then, even to hear the name Medes spoken would strike terror into Hellenes. End quote. So there's a intimidation factor here. There's also a, tactical reality that the Greeks understand. The Persians have cavalry. And cavalry is something that the Greek way of fighting without extra troops around can't deal with. I mean, if you're in a formation where the number one thing you have to do is stand shoulder to shoulder with the guys around you and not break formation because then you're doomed, how do you deal with cavalry that you can't catch, that can ride up to you in small squadrons and pelt you with javelins, and then as you move out to deal with them, run away? And if you chase them, you break your formation, and then you're meat for that same cavalry, right, that can come in there now that you're all disordered and take you apart. The Greeks also don't have archers, the one thing that might keep that cavalry at arm's length, right? It's a way to respond, at least, at the tactical level. They don't have that either. But the Persians do, lots of them. So that'll keep you camped out for a while wondering what to do. The other reason that historians think it's a logical thing to wonder about, that the Athenians are waiting for here, are for Spartans. They sent a runner to Sparta, remember, as opposed to a championship chariot driver or horseman. We don't understand why, but he made it in record time, so who's going to argue? And then this person tells the Spartans, you can't let this greatest city of all Greece get wiped out and taken by barbarians. And the Spartans say, yeah, we'll be there, but we're in the middle of a religious festival right now. Can't make it right this second. But as soon as the moon gets into this proper phase, we're there. And so the Athenians are waiting there for the Spartans, and, Hopefully nothing happens before then. Historians wonder why the Persians are waiting also, and many theories center around the idea that they're waiting for, the coup d'etat to occur in Athens, right? For the people there to, the realism party, which the war party would call the collaborator party, the Medizers, just waiting for those guys to get the upper hand. And those same historians think maybe those guys are waiting for the Persians to defeat the Athenian army and then throw open the gates. Everybody kind of wants to hedge their bets, right? That's natural. But if Athens' gates are thrown open, the Persians can just get back in their ships, maybe leave a covering force on the beach, and sail around to Athens and go take it while the army that should be defending Athens is still waiting for the Spartans at Marathon. And truthfully, this is an enormously compelling story, and always has been, if you look at it from the Greek side. And, as much as I'm trying to look at this from the Persian side, I'm only human, and I'm a fan of history. And, if you forget all that, fun we were having with the nonsense of the home team of Western civilization, there's still a compelling angle that a totally neutral screenwriter would want to exploit here. Forget Herodotus, who's, Greek anyway, writing for a Greek audience. I mean, if you're a Persian screenwriter, you might turn this story into a great movie because, these Athenians have no chance. They're not just the underdogs, but the stakes are everything. If the Persians lose here, and what are the odds of that? They almost never lose. No big deal to them. If the Athenians lose, well, there's two ways of looking at it, the macro and the micro. The micro is if the Athenians lose, they get sold into slavery. The males probably all die. A lot of people die. It's going to be horrible, and they will pay for all they've done to Persia. But on the macro, Athens hasn't reached its civilizational high point yet, as historians might place it. The part of Athens that makes it so influential on the rest of world history, the reason we still think of it as different now, they really haven't come to that point yet. They're on the way. Democracy has started and all these things, but the high water mark is still a ways away. If they get wiped out before that happens, well, there's a lot of ways you could play that what-if game, right? So on the macro level, we all have a stake in maybe Athens surviving a little bit longer at least. But there's almost no chance of that. Right now, the Persian numbers are unknown as always. The ancient sources put them as high as 500,000 Persians there on the beach somehow being fed and everything. Well, that's crazy. I've seen numbers as low as 8,000 or 9,000, which would make the Greeks outnumber them. That seems unlikely too. Historians usually think there was about a 3-to-1 outnumbering. That's a pretty safe number to throw in there. Also, the range 25,000 to 50,000 men seems pretty normal to run into. There's debate over whether or not the whole army was there on the beach or whether or not some of them were still embarked on ships going elsewhere doing other things. No one knows. But not only do you have this intimidating army, which Herodotus specifically mentions the intimidation factor of Persians there on the beach, but they probably outnumber you, and they might outnumber you 3-to-1, and you don't even have the Spartans with you, and you don't have any cavalry, and you don't have any archers. So not only is this like a David and Goliath struggle, but it's like you go up to David and say, by the way, give me that sling and that rock too, and anything else you might be carrying, and take your shoes off and do this barefoot. How many things can be against these Athenians? It's something that adds to the compelling nature of the story. The odds are just incredible, and then they keep getting worse. Earlier, we talked about history as a crime scene and how often historians have to go in there and, be the investigators. There have been so many different interpretations on this Battle of Marathon that is about to happen here. And you'd expect that there would be a lot of interest. After all, this battle is often infused with almost mythical levels of importance. I think it was John Stuart Mill who said that the Battle of Marathon was a more significant event in British history than the Battle of Hastings was. But what's kind of crazy is for such an important event, we know so little about it for sure, and it leaves a lot of room for the experts to sit there and disagree because there's a ton of things that have to be pieced together. Number one on the list is how the heck does it even happen? According to Herodotus, who's one of the closest earliest sources about 70, 75 years later, he says there's a disagreement amongst the commanders, these democratically elected generals, of whom Miltiades is one. And Herodotus says Miltiades and 4 other generals want to attack, And 5 other generals on the other side don't want to attack. Boom, an even split. So he says Miltiades then goes to the war archon, who's there, who can break the deadlock, and Miltiades gives him a whole bunch of arguments why he should. The only one that has any bearing on why all of a sudden the Athenians should go on the offensive instead of waiting for the Spartans, right? I mean, you would think they would wait. Miltiades doesn't want to wait, and he says that the people in Athens, are liable to turn against them, to, go over to the collaboration side, to Medides, if they don't do something. The rot will get worse, according to one of my translations. That's how he puts it. So the longer we sit here, the more the chances are that the tide will turn and the wrong party will get a hold of Athens and they'll open the gates, and all of this will be for naught. So we can't wait for the Spartans. A later tradition, a very late tradition, probably an unreliable tradition, suggests that there was a turncoat, a spy on the Persian side, who told the Greeks that the Persian cavalry was gone. The horsemen are away. It's an old line. The reason that comes up is because nobody can figure out how the biggest thing that the Greeks were worried about, the Persian cavalry, how it's not going to play any important role at all, no mentionable role in what's about to happen. Given the fact that Herodotus emphasizes that they had specially built horse transports, made to convey the horses, and that Marathon was specifically chosen because it would be good for cavalry, where the heck are the horses when all of a sudden Miltiades is able to convince the war archon to support an aggressive attack against the Persian lines? I should also point out that there are other historians who think that what probably happened here is that the Persians decided to attack, and the Greeks, put on their armor, got all ready, formed up, and met them. Another line of thinking is that the Persians finally decided to move. Nothing's happening here. Let's get on our ships and we'll sail to Athens, and, we'll wave to this army as we leave them on the beach, and then we'll beat them back to their home city. Doesn't matter what happened. Apparently, the Greeks moved out. According to Herodotus, they lined up their troops in a way so that they could match the Persian line, which supposedly outnumbered them. And so in order to match the length of the opposite side, they had to make their ranks thinner. Herodotus says that on the wings they were normal depth, which most historians think was about 8 ranks deep, but he says that they were only a few ranks deep in the center. A lot of historians think that's more like 4 ranks deep. So they're taking a chance here. They'll avoid getting outflanked on the left or the right by matching the length of the Persian line, but they're taking a chance by going awful shallow in the center. The center is where the Persians put their best troops. According to Herodotus, the Persians are caught off guard by an army of more than 10,000 spearmen charging them at a run. He writes, quote, "After the troops were in position and the sacrifices had proven favorable, when the Athenians were let loose and allowed to advance, they charged at a run toward the barbarians. The space between the two armies was about a mile, and the Persians, who saw the Athenians advancing towards them on the double, prepared to meet their attack. They assumed that the Athenians were seized by some utterly self-destructive madness, as they observed how few the Athenians were in number, and how they were charging toward them with neither cavalry nor archers in support. So the barbarians suspected that the Athenians had gone mad." End quote. Historians have been tearing apart Herodotus' account of events ever since, but in many ways, we can't expect him to give us the sort of details that we need to envision what's really going on here. But 100 years ago, Hans Delbruck was saying there's no way those hoplites ran a mile in armor and then got to the Persian lines where they then had to exert themselves fighting. Impossible. So the many, many books and papers written out there about what actually happened at Marathon will disagree about all the specifics. And of course, what everyone would love is a little bit more detail from Herodotus. He sets this great story up and then he doesn't tell us anything about the archery or the cavalry or what happened. There's just, you're left to piece it together. It does appear that there was some running involved because the battle would become known as a battle where these hoplites ran into contact. Victor Davis Hansen says, over the years to follow, veterans of this battle could tell others that they fought there simply by saying, "We ran," and everyone would know what that meant. And it makes sense, too, to a lot of historians, because if you're going to run into one of the great bow-fire armies in history, we said earlier, like a machine gun of archery fire, you don't want to sort of move into contact by taking your time, right? You want to get to the line so you can start to fight and not suck up any more arrows than you have to on the way in, so it makes sense. Like almost all the ancient writers, Herodotus is just vague on all the details we would want. There's a lot of writing about why this is, and there seem to be two general reasons. One, the ancient authors thought it maybe not up to the style that they liked to go into the gory details we wonder about in terms of the blood and the guts and everything and how it was visually for the senses like a horror movie. But also so many of the physical elements, the physics of the battlefield, like we talked about earlier, that we'd like to understand better, was known to them and their audience of mostly people who would have occasionally have fought in battles like this, so it would be known to them too. Here's the way, Hans van Wees sort of points out this well-understood problem we have with the sources not telling us things that's obvious to them, but that baffle us. Quote, "Exactly how hoplites fought their fearsome battles is not immediately clear from ancient descriptions. All the most explicit evidence relates to the heavy infantry employed by the Macedonian and Hellenistic kingdoms from Philip II and Alexander the Great onwards, rather than to the heavy infantry of the Greek city-states. Archaic and classical Greek authors assumed that their audiences were familiar with the experience of combat, and apart from recording the occasional striking detail, described battle only in the most general terms. Armies advance, fight, and, in quotation marks, push until one side, in quotation marks, breaks and runs," end quote. So it's sort of left to modern-day historians to sort of fill in the gaps a little bit. And one of the best accounts, if you're going to do this movie, you're going to turn Herodotus' story into a movie, you want a guy like historian Tom Holland to do the, modern-day screenplay because it's cinematic. He turns it into one of these Charge of the Light Brigade type stories, which it kind of is, so he's sticking to the spirit of the event. And he has this phalanx, advancing into combat, and all of a sudden the storm of arrows starts. And he's got the countdown. They're at 150 yards. They're at 100 yards. They're at 50 yards, all the way getting closer and closer. And then he writes, quote, "Those of the enemy directly in their path had already begun scrabbling to erect wicker defenses, as they realized to their horror that the wall of shields and iron-tipped spears, far from providing easy pickings for their bowmen, as they had first imagined, was not going to be halted. 100 yards, 50, 20, 10. Then, as the Athenians' war cry, a terrifying ululation, rose even above the thundering of their feet upon the dry earth. The cacophony of clattering metal and the screams of the panic-stricken enemy, the phalanx crunched into the Persian lines. The impact was devastating," he writes. The Athenians had honed their style of warfare in combat with other phalanxes, wooden shields smashing against wooden shields, iron spear tips clattering against breastplates of bronze. Now, though, in these first terrible seconds of collision, there was nothing but a pulverizing crash of metal into flesh and bone, then a rolling of the Athenian tide over men wearing, at most, quilted jerkins for protection, and armed, perhaps, with nothing more than bows or slings. The hoplites' ash spears, rather than shivering, as invariably happened when one phalanx crashed into another, could instead stab and stab again, and those of the enemy who avoided their fearful jabbing might easily be crushed to death beneath the sheer weight of the advancing men of bronze." End quote. The account by Herodotus leaves out almost all the stuff you'd want to know about. I mean, his official account of the battle, this most famous of, military charges against all odds, like I said, sort of like a Charge of the Light Brigade kind of thing. He says, quote, "They fought in the battle at Marathon for a long time. The barbarians prevailed in the center of the line, where the Persians themselves and the Saqa were deployed, and as the barbarians were winning here, they broke through the line of the Hellenes and chased them inland. But at the same time, the Athenians and Plataeans were prevailing on the wings. In their victory there, they allowed the barbarian troops that they had routed to flee, and then drawing both their wings together, they fought those enemy troops who had broken through the center. And in this encounter, too, the Athenians were victorious. And as the Persians fled, the Athenians pursued them and cut them down until they reached the sea, where they called for fire and started to seize the ships." End quote. One of the things that's crazy about Herodotus as a screenwriter, if that's what we're going to see him as, is here he's trying to please an audience of Greeks, including Greek veterans, and he goes into loving paragraph after paragraph detail, over something like Darius and his 6 hit team assassins going after the false Bardia. And yet, for one of the greatest battles in world history, even recognized at that time as being a huge deal, he gives us like 3 paragraphs from start to finish. And in those 3 paragraphs, he takes some time off with some digressions. And the one real solid thing you would think you could count on in terms of a fact turns out to be wrong, almost assuredly. This is a perfect example why so many of the historians of this period have to be like crime scene investigators, and how little they have to go on, and how they'll ingeniously do things like mine the plays and the drama being performed in the Greek theater, for example, during this era, right? Popular entertainment. Because the playwrights who were writing these plays were oftentimes veterans, sometimes veterans of these very conflicts we're talking about. And the audience members were too. And so if they make a joke about the, rich guy who shows up at the phalanx with the super nice clothes and the triple horsehair crest with the ostrich feathers and the Nimbus 2000 armor, and then by the end of the battle, it's all brown below the waist because he defecated on himself out of fear, and the audience laughs, it's kind of because those things may have happened. The audience is probably sitting there going, I know a guy just like that, right? Which is why it played well. And the historians can go, aha, we can piece together that piece of information into the puzzle of what it was like to fight these kind of battles. Listen, full disclosure here, there's a small chance that I've told you this entire tale so that I'd have a reason to talk about my fascination with ancient combat. I'm fascinated with all combat, actually, because they all combat experiences tend to score pretty highly on my list of extremes of human experience. And as I said earlier, I'm fascinated by that. But the different eras each come with their own particularly horrifying variables. And there are certain elements of warfare that are unchanged since the Stone Age. But there's a ton that's different too, right? What you face in, say, the Battle of Verdun or the Battle of the Somme or something in the First World War is a very different experience from what the ancient soldier faced, obviously. In a warfare sense, it's a little like the difference between a 100-yard dash, and a, if you'll pardon the pun, marathon. Ancient warfare is sprinting. Modern 20th century, long war warfare, those are long, hard distance runs. The challenges to the frontline soldier are different, too. It's like the worst game ever of would you rather. Would you rather be a, soldier in the trenches in the First World War, or would you rather be an ancient Persian warrior at the Battle of Marathon? Take your choice. The challenges and the stress on your psyche is different, isn't it, in those two kinds of situations? You think of the modern soldier, and there's a drip, 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 constant pressure, if you think about it, on the psyche of men who will serve, a week or two or longer on the front lines, in the trenches, under fire, 24/7 risk of death day after day. That beats on you in a certain way. The ancient warriors facing a different task. Their lives are relatively fine most of the time outside of battle day, but on battle day, the stress, the intensity, and the fear is extreme. And so they don't get a drip, drip, drip on their psyche. They get a tidal wave, on their psyche that hits over the space of a couple of hours. equally horrific challenge, but different. And when I think about myself, and I think this is our modern bias, by the way, I think we all have it, though, but in terms of my modern bias as to what I'm going to pick the First World War, which I have described several of the battles of as reminding me of Mordor. But the First World War, as unimaginable as some of it is something I can conceptualize. I think we're conditioned to understand better things closer to our own time. And the way they fought in the First World War is something, we grew up understanding, right? Sit there and use the machine gun, sit there, be under fire. I mean, it's all a part of our understanding of essentially modern warfare and what people go through and soldiers we know and all that. Ancient warfare is much more exotic and therefore perhaps scary. And it's only exotic because of the time difference, because they were doing this kind of warfare, from Stone Age times up until a couple hundred years ago. But for modern people watching it, it looks horrifically similar to watching Jack the Ripper at work. It is butchery in the pure sense of the word. And it's close up. You're looking into the eyes of the people you're killing. Maybe I'm just a modern wimp, but it's a lot easier for me to shoot from across a nice little intervening distance at somebody moving towards me whose face I can just barely make out than it is to sit there and hear the grunts and the groans and the last breath out of their mouth. And I think most people feel that way. One soldier, quoted in one of the books I read, had said that when you're close up and you can hear them, it's a bitch. Well, in ancient warfare, most of the time, once the arrow fire was done with, it was a bitch. Here's what historian Hans van Wees writes concerning the differences in what a soldier in the modern 20th century great wars, for example, might have faced, and what the ancient warriors on the battlefield at Marathon faced. He writes, quote, "The trauma of ancient Greek battle was different from the experiences which leave so many modern soldiers shell-shocked or debilitated by post-traumatic stress disorder. Greek soldiers," he writes, "rarely came close to suffering the extremes of physical deprivation associated with trench or jungle warfare, and never saw their friends blown to pieces. On the other hand, hoplites suffered the devastating experience, almost unknown in modern warfare, dominated as it is by long-range fighting with guns, artillery, and bombs, of standing at no more than an arm's length from the enemy, and laying into one man after another with spear, sword, and ultimately bare hands and teeth." End quote. See, this is where ancient combat becomes like my little laboratory for observing us. And what's innate in us versus what's an effect of our culture on our development. I mean, think about yourself for a second. I think you, like me, can imagine yourself firing a rifle at some enemy. Can you really imagine yourself under almost any conditions on a battlefield, holding one end of the spear as you drive the other end into the chest or face of another human being? And then, by the way, you're not done. You have to go then to the next human being and do something like that again, or hope you can. Or if that doesn't work and you're down to your other weapon, slicing them or stabbing them with a sword face to face while they try to do the same to you. I mean, some of you can. I understand that we have all kinds of people. But I mean, for the majority of you out there, is this something you could realistically imagine yourself doing under almost any circumstance? And I ask that because, remember, most of the people in these Greek city-states, with, Sparta accepted, are regular people. I mean, these are not professional warriors. These are commercial people. These are bakers. These are farmers. These are even, the politicians of Athens would be out there even. I mean, these people are going back to their jobs the day after the battle. I can't help but think about us in the same situation. I mean, if the great simulation player in the sky, I can't help but think about my Nick Bostrom simulation theory at a time like this. If he changes the preference on his game to one that no longer allows us to have any weapons that were invented after the year 1300, could we go back to fighting the way they fought back then? I mean, could we create a city-state phalanx, maybe the Los Angeles phalanx, train it up for a little while, send it back in time to take on the average city-state's phalanx in ancient Greek times, and have them not defecate and run away as soon as the spears of the enemy came close? I mean, I'm wondering if you could even train one of our military units up that way. Forget the people of Los Angeles. They may be a little too thin for this gig. But, I mean, if you could train a military unit of ours for a year and send them back, I bet you they'd be better than the Greek phalanx at maneuvering and drill and all that kind of stuff. I bet they'd have that down. It's the rubber meets the road moment, though, that counts when they have to face the spears headlong of a citizen phalanx of bakers and potters and farmers who've done this before, from a culture that understands it. Do you think our even military unit would stand there when the spears start jabbing in each other's faces and not run away? And here's the, question that really gets me thinking. If you won't stand there, because we just don't do that, it's not our culture, we don't have what they have anymore, how long would it take to get it back? If you decided, the great simulator in the sky just took guns away, we have to fight like this if we're going to defend ourselves, how long would it take? How long does it take for the culture to rebuild the ability to do a skill that has not been necessary for a very long time? And the thing is you wouldn't think it would be so difficult theoretically. But it turns out that over the last several hundred years, as people have shot at each other more on the battlefields, it's become harder and harder to actually, walk up to somebody else and stick them with a pointy object. There's been quite a bit written about this. It seems to be both particularly feared, as one might expect, but also particularly abhorrent to the people who have to do the skewering. And I've read elsewhere, this is one of the things that makes some of the famed military units out there, like the British Gurkhas, for example, that are known for hand-to-hand combat, more particularly intimidating, because unlike most people, they're generally okay with the idea of coming to close grips. Most people would rather, stay away, because obviously it's nasty stuff. In his book On Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman says that it is the proximity to the victim that determines, how resistant to killing people tend to be, and that by the time you get to like bayonet range, he says, the resistance on the part of human beings, both on the receiving end and the giving end of the bayonet, is intense. But what happens when you're talking about a period in warfare where that's not an unusual event as it is in modern warfare? It's the way you do business. It's how you fight. We stick people with pointy things, or they stick us with theirs. Welcome to war for, most of human history from the Stone Age until a couple hundred years ago. Nowadays, it's the nastiest thing most soldiers contemplate. Grossman, along with a lot of other historians, goes on to point out how most historians think that the idea that there was ever bayonet fighting, bayonets, those long knives on the ends of rifles that people used for a long time. I mean, the American Revolution, we had them, the Napoleonic Wars, the U.S. Civil War, the First World War. They still use bayonets or have them for militaries today. But it seems like almost never is anyone killed by one. And the dirty little secret, apparently, according to Grossman and others, is that one side always runs before having to get stuck by the other. And usually, according to Grossman, the side that didn't have to stick the other side is kind of glad they didn't have to either. He says when two bayonet lines came together historically, he said, quote, very often neither side can bring itself to close with the enemy's bayonets. The advance falters and the two parties begin to fire at one another from ridiculously short ranges, end quote. He then quotes some other stories that say when soldiers would come in bayonet range with other soldiers, somehow they just managed to turn their guns around and were often using the butts of their rifles as clubbing instruments instead. He said, quote, we can understand then that the average soldier has an intense resistance towards bayoneting his fellow man, and that this act is surpassed only by the resistance to being bayoneted. The horror of being bayoneted is intense, end quote. Well, of course it is. So he said that modern people don't want to stick a knife into anybody else and that they don't want a knife stuck into them. Makes perfect sense. But nowadays, you can avoid that in most cases. This is the goal of ancient battle, the very thing he says modern people would most like to avoid. Grossman is quoting veterans who are saying that the worst thing that they ever dealt with was the kind of thing that Greek and Persian soldiers dealt with in every battle. What's missing, of course, from this whole question is something from the Persian side to try to get an idea of what it was like for a Persian soldier fighting in the ranks. After all, we try to look at this a little bit more than, well, at least normal from the Persian side of things, but there aren't any accounts, from individual soldiers in the ranks or generals or anything from the Persian side that has come down to us that would give us the equivalent of what the Greeks do, which is a tiny little window, one more little tile in the mosaic, helping the historical investigators to recreate a little bit about what this combat must have been like. It's sort of historically ironic that what little you can divine about what this must have been like for the Persians, you get from the Greek sources, often talking about hoplites who fought differently than their opponents. You have to weed out things that are specifically part of the Greek hoplite experience. That wouldn't apply to Persia, and say something like that. And then notice the other things, maybe we would call them the physics of the battlefield, that would be present for anybody in a pre-gunpowder battle, whether we're talking about the wounds or the fear. Persians have to deal with that on their side as much as the Greeks have to deal with it on theirs, but we may only have the Greeks' version of the events in order to extrapolate what the Persian experience must have been like. We've mentioned the idea a couple of times of a creeping incontinence and then turning and running away. Because in these ancient battles, fear is the key component. In fact, one could make a case that the main thing that a general wants to figure out how to do in a battle plan is how to create the biggest chance that you're going to scare the other side. I mean, if you think about people as kind of like spooked animals, have you ever seen a horse herd when they get scared and all of a sudden the fear spreads from the initial point of contact to the little rattlesnake that scared them or whatever, and, sort of moves like a shock wave through the whole herd? That's what people facing danger would choose to do if allowed to do whatever came naturally, right? We see danger, we go in the other direction. Part of what military discipline has been aiming to do pretty much since ancient Sumeria or before is to keep people from giving in to that natural urge, right? That self-defense preservation urge, an evolutionary advantage, certainly, right? And the reason fear is a bigger, more acute problem on an ancient battlefield than a modern one has to do with the size. When you have an occasion where units panic and run, break, rout, whatever term you want to use, in the big modern wars, that is a small cancer in a big organism. And it can usually be isolated and cauterized relatively easily without the entire enterprise along a giant line being too badly affected. But in the constrained space of these ancient battlefields, panic was contagious. And you don't know how many people it takes to run before, everybody does. Nonetheless, when people start to run, it's almost as though the little thin piece of your intellect that is keeping you where you're supposed to be due to all military discipline and everything else snaps. And you've heard that saying, last one is a rotten egg. On the ancient battlefield, last one is dead would be a better phrase. Because when a rout happens, the people most likely to stand and try to stick it out are the ones who are the most brave, the least likely to give in, the ones that don't want to be cowards and shirkers and who aren't going to run away, but they're also the last to get away and the ones who get speared in the back first during the pursuit, where the majority of casualties are dished out, by the way. That's where you die on an ancient battle. Historian Richard Gabriel says, quote, "In every army there is a mob waiting to escape, and its motivation is fear. The real killer on the ancient battlefield was fear. Men in combat have their instinctive flight or fight responses held in delicate balance by a thin string of intellect. Continued stress increases the probability that someone within the ranks will lose his nerve and run. Sometimes the actions of a single soldier are sufficient to forge the onset of panic in an entire unit. Once the integrity of the formation began to erode, the ancient soldier was at very great risk of death or injury." End quote. And so everybody's kind of, trying to stand their ground without wanting to be the last guy to get away if things go badly. So, everything's sort of held by such a narrow strand of discipline. The Greeks used to talk about the god Phobos, and that's from the root of the same word that gave us phobia, meaning fear, or the god Pan, the root of the word panic, who could sometimes come into these ancient battlefields and sweep through them and like a herd of horses, just spook everybody. I mean, if you saw someone get around your flank on an ancient battlefield, you might run, you might spook, and if you do, the unit next to you might spook also. If you see a friendly unit rout, you might spook and run. And if a bunch of people in your unit start getting torn to pieces in a bloody carnage right near you, you might decide to turn and run too. Or your psyche might decide to eliminate all choice from the matter, and terror, blind terror, might just take over. And fear is actually, something that is exploitable and that's paid attention to. I mean, you feel like there's almost a connection to the animal kingdom when you're talking about warfare in the era where you came to grips with your adversary, or nearly so. In the same way, some of those animals will get up on their, hind legs or stand up tall, or their neck will bulge out to make them look bigger. It's a psychological thing, right? It's a intimidation move, maybe you could call it. I mean, part of the reason these Greeks have these giant crests on their helmet, same reason those Napoleonic troops would get those really, tall grenadier caps too. It makes you look taller. It gives you that little bit of extra intimidation, imposing factor on an opponent that, at least in Greek times, you might come face to face with. And that's when something like a little extra intimidation factor could be the difference between life or death. In fact, some units were considered to be, and some peoples and armies were considered to be extra intimidating. There are stories about whole units running before combat, sometimes running after they see the lambdas on the Spartan shields, so that they knew, the people in front of us are Spartans. Some people didn't wait around to see how that was going to turn out. And so to be intimidating was just one extra thing that helped the Spartans when they actually came to battle. And there were bunches of units and types of troops that had those sorts of intimidating reputations that sort of preceded them. To be intimidating is something that can actually give you an edge in hand-to-hand combat. And, even that term, hand-to-hand combat, it sounds almost nice, doesn't it? Like a helping hand. When in reality, I keep trying to remind myself that we are talking about, what if it happened in a, civilian sort of context today would be a face-to-face brutal murder. There's a lot of footage you can watch of modern conflicts in many places where you'll see someone get killed and they'll be manning a gun somewhere or moving somewhere, and all of a sudden you'll hear a crack, sometimes from a distance where no one's looking, and someone will fall down, and it'll be this horrifying experience for all concerned who are there. But it's this shock. It's over in 2 seconds, and you don't even, the terror is sort of after the fact. It's a whole different thing when you get a chance to march up and see your fate, as it marches towards you, and, knowing that one of you is not getting out here alive, and you both might die. And as you're getting closer to people, summing up, which person out of that crowd of people you're running towards you're going to aim towards, and what might be aiming towards you. I mean, the thoughts that run through the head that challenge you in different ways in these ancient battles, you again just wonder how people did this. Historians often use the book The Iliad, the stories of Homer, as a tool to understand kind of how these weapons, what kind of wounds that they inflicted and how people reacted and whatnot, because the weapons are the same, even if maybe how they used them was different. And it's terrifying stuff. It's one horrific, outcome after another. The spear goes through the eye hole and the brain oozes down the shaft. I mean, it's stuff like that. Horrible things. Lots of people get hit in the groin, and it's awful. And you turn around and you start to realize, maybe the reason that these ancient playwrights and these authors didn't get into the gory details, about all these battles that we want to hear because we can't imagine it, might be because the people in their audience might have been trying to forget some of it. But it's absolutely terrifying. Warfare is terrifying anyway, but having to face this kind of conflict, And, you need to remember, at least in terms of the Greek phalanx, a lot of times the people fighting right next to you are relatives and friends and loved ones and local politicians and the butcher and the baker and the people that you know. And that's great in terms of stiffening you and helping your resolve and fostering sort of a camaraderie from people, who aren't training together all the time. You have the camaraderie naturally because you're related and you know each other and you grew up together and what have you. But when those people start dying, it's the double-edged sword of that effect. And all of a sudden, you in the ranks trying to keep it together and not run are watching, your loved ones and people get speared in the face and having the brain run through the eye hole down the shaft of the spear. It's terrifying on a you don't even know how people control themselves. Forget about having any sort of conscious sense of fear. The Greeks were terrified too, although people have been, let's just say, very respectful of the power of combat forever, but stories abound. Besides the involuntary loss of the incontinence, shall we say, of the rankers, there's stories of trembling in the ranks. There's stories of teeth chattering that was so loud and widespread, I think it was supposed to have drowned out the sound of a speaker. People understood what they faced, and there was involuntary responses to that are just human. How did these soldiers deal with this fear? Well, how would you deal with it? How have soldiers dealt with it forever? There have been widespread conversations, shall we say, amongst historians for a very long time over how much you should or should not assume the presence of alcohol in a lot of these battles or other drugs. There are all kinds of problems trying to figure this out. I mean, for example, in a lot of these cultures, they drank a lot anyway. How do you separate what was the normal wine ration for a breakfast for some of these soldiers, from the extra amount they drank because they were going to, face a wall of spears that they had to run into head on that day? Again, hard to figure. One historian, when asked to theorize about the likelihood of hoplites going into battle drunk, he said that the likelihood was that they were almost drunk. So take that for what it's worth, but, who would be surprised? And, one part of me wonders how people gear themselves up to do this, but the other part of me wonders how they live with it afterwards. I mean, do things haunt their dreams? How would you react if you killed someone by hand? What if you killed 8 people with a knife over your lifetime? Would that change you? How would that change you? Would you still be normal? What is normal? I mean, what if you'd done this in the service of your country, killed 8 people with a knife? You're a hero. Are you unaffected? And if you're affected, how are you affected? And if that's not normal, especially in our society today, and that person is unusual, when compared to the normal, rank and file of the population, they have an unusual experience. What about the ancient world, where in some of these places you could reasonably expect a decent percentage of the, people in these societies to have killed people in hand-to-hand combat, sometimes multiple people? So, in other words, what might be very abnormal in this society to be a person who's killed multiple people with an edged weapon might be a relatively normal experience in some of these other places. How does that change the society? I mean, when people could say, my husband did that, my dad did that, my grandfather did that and killed 16 people, actually, and I hope my son will grow up someday and do that too. I mean, when that's, the carrots and sticks and the expectation levels in society, how does that alter the equation? And this whole question about culture and environment and nature, nurture, I guess you could say it even goes back to, really manifests when you read some of the debates between the experts on whether or not these ancient peoples suffered from what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder because of their involvement in this kind of murderous conflict. Historian Richard Gabriel suggests that there must have been thousands of psychological casualties after these terrible ancient battles. But there's a whole school of thought that suggests that that's not true. And by the way, it's been wonderful to see the addition to the traditional historians and classicists who've been dealing with this kind of question forever. Neuroscientists, evolutionary biologists, biochemists, and people who, focus so much on how the brain functions, because some of this stuff that these people go through can be impacted by the way they were raised, but some of this stuff is just how your brain is wired. Hard to figure out where one ends and the other begins, and the debate is fantastic. For example, if we went back in our little mythical encounter between the Los Angeles phalanx and the city-state of Thebes, do you think if you could go interview the survivors of the Los Angeles phalanx 40 years later, that we'd be expecting some psychological PTSD, hangover-type casualties, some effects? I imagine we would all expect there to be some, let's just say, haunting memories at the very least. The question over whether the ancients actually suffered from this, though, is interesting. And as you might imagine, historians and others comb through the original material. In fact, at the Battle of Marathon, Herodotus says there is a case that modern-day researchers often point to as an example of, PTSD. Herodotus says there's a story of a soldier who went blind at the battle, but who was totally uninjured. The story is that he saw a huge warrior with a huge beard coming to strike him, and instead the warrior struck the man next to him, and the sight instantly disappeared from this man, and he never got it back. And a lot of, as I said, modern-day researchers point to that as an example of what in the First World War, the Second World War, they might have called hysterical blindness. One of these guys I was reading called it a convergence disorder or something like that. It's above my pay grade, you understand. But the point was, as they suggested, in 20th century combat, it would not be an unexpected thing to have happen. Anthropologist Alan Young, for example, says that what we call PTSD today is not timeless or uniform. He says that the idea of traumatic memory is, quote, man-made, end quote, something that originated in 19th century thought. And he says, quote, before that time there is unhappiness, despair, and disturbing recollections, but no traumatic memory in the sense that we know it today. In short, the person who quotes him that I'm reading from says it's a culturally conditioned response to trauma. End quote. The person who I'm quoting from, though, is historian Lawrence Triddle, who is suggesting that due to neuroscience now becoming involved, it's starting to look more and more like the responses that modern-day soldiers have to some of their combat experiences is timeless and has a sort of a universal soldier, they call it, aspect to it, the kind of thing where modern-day soldiers would be able to commiserate with these hoplites or these Persians at Marathon and talk about some similar things maybe. I've read some other interesting things that suggest that the Greeks, for example, maybe the Persians too, wouldn't have had any bad thoughts about the people they killed. They wouldn't have been haunted by ghosts and stuff like that because all the societal carrots and sticks reward that. They would have been notches on the sword belt. The family honor would have gone up. No societies really discourage the killing of, enemies to the people or the state or your local district or what have you. So there would have been a ton of support for the idea that great things have been done, things worth bragging about as opposed to, fretting about. At the same time, anybody's liable to go through these experiences that just haunt your nightmares and you wake up in cold sweats from later, right? Forget about you killing somebody else. How about you narrowly being killed yourself? Or watching your buddy have that spear shoved through his face, or whatever it might be. The panic of the moment. Isn't it just human to expect that that might come and find you later in your dreams or elsewhere? Or does your culture insulate you somehow from that too? One article I read suggested maybe a case could be made that enough of these societies where enough of those people had experienced incidents like that could be called a traumatized society. And does that explain things that it, would go through and did? I mean, does it take a traumatized society to fight in one of these battles that would traumatize us today because they're insulated from it? I don't know the answer to any of these things, but I find them all fascinating, and I find that the laboratory that helps us to do experiments with these kinds of questions is ancient battle. So it opens up the door. I told you, I'm totally fascinated by what this can tell us about people and culture and stuff like that. And when we think about cultural differences for a minute, let's remember what, as many of you will always point out to me, what these people grew up watching, what their lives were like. I mean, these are people that in a lot of these eras enjoyed going to executions for the entertainment value. All right, so let's remember that a little bit. Victor Davis Hanson tells a story in trying to give us an idea about how terrifyingly horrible the battlefields were the day after the battle was over in any of these ancient battles. And he says that sightseers would go to the battles, that sometimes the rulers who had won these battles would actually, ferry the sightseers over, and sometimes couldn't even keep up with the demand, these people that wanted to walk, not for looting purposes, just for entertainment value. Now, let me say something here. I know we're a sick bunch, and I know that if you put this stuff up on YouTube, a lot of you out there would go and watch it. Many of you out there would click on the website video that showed you one of these battlefields afterwards, which is really indicative of how nasty these battles are because, unlike modern warfare, this all happens in a confined space, and it is the confined space that creates the uniquely horrific slaughterhouse that is an ancient battlefield, which, by the way, is a historically extinct thing. Nobody will ever see this again, and nobody has seen it for like 400 years. This kind of slaughter in a combined space. Would you go on the tour? I've said I want to be in that hot air balloon, which, by the way, I read in another book someone else said, so I've obviously ripped it off unconsciously. But I've often said I want to be up there in the hot air balloon, looking down and answering all of my questions about how did this formation that had no drill actually move on the battlefield, totally forgetting that going on 100 feet below me is absolute madness. People absolutely scared out of their minds, cutting each other up madness. And there's no way I'm going on the foot tour afterwards. I had somebody I knew once who said that, you could kind of say that modern warfare is like a bunch of jumbo jets crashing over a relatively wide area. And the bodies are often burned or torn up, and that's considered to be an extra bad thing. If you're in the First World War, it's the torn up bodies are destabilizing to your mind. It's awful. And the smell is like, of explosives or fuel. But if you go to an ancient battlefield, it looks a lot more like a bunch of individual murders, thousands of them. Xenophon wrote and basically made it sound like you could kind of walk the battlefield and recreate what you were seeing. This guy stabbed that guy. These two people killed each other, but both died. You're watching a lot of different individual stories when you walk those battlefields, and you're getting your shoes extremely dirty. Victor Davis Hanson reconstructs, what one of these fields must have looked like. And remember, he's talking about the onlookers who would go afterwards to experience what it was like at one of these battlefields the day afterwards. By the way, Herodotus says like 6,400 Persians died at Marathon and about 200 Greeks, which shows you how one-sided ancient battle could be if those numbers are correct. Imagine going to the battlefield the day after that. Here's how Hanson describes the reality of this historically extinct thing that must have been very familiar to, human beings for tens of thousands of years. He writes, quote, "Besides the sheer concentration of bodies, the most common sight to these onlookers would have been the quantity of spilled blood and gore. In some of the larger battles, between hoplites, Delion, Leuctra, and Plataea, thousands of corpses lay with huge gaping wounds from the spear and sword. Since the flesh was never incinerated, as it came to be in modern battles, by the explosion of bomb and shell, and because the entry and exit wounds created by double-edged iron spearheads tends to be larger than those caused by small arms fire, the bodies would have drained much of their bodily fluids upon the ground. Walking among the pile of corpses entailed treading everywhere over stained earth and pools of blood. Polybius says that after Zama, the battlefield was so thick with bloody corpses that it was nearly impossible to advance over the ground, which suggests that many had attempted to do just that. In his famous description of Coronea, Xenophon recalls that the very earth had turned red, a phrase that was probably no exaggeration. And in Sicily, at the final slaughter of the Athenians in 413, the bodies of the dead lay piled on top of each other in the water, their spilled blood turning the very current red. Plutarch recorded a similar picture after the death of some 25,000 Macedonian pikemen at Pydna. The entire plain there, he says, was filled with corpses, and the river Leucos ran red with their blood. Again, this seems likely. If each of the fallen men lost a mere third of his 6 quarts of blood, either during the final moments of death or after the corpse lay in the dust, there could have been more than 10,000 gallons to soak the field. End quote. 10,000 gallons of blood soaking a field that's 10 or 20 football fields long. To me, simply walking that field the next day would be one of the extremes of human experience. I can't imagine being one of the people who had to create that mess. Or, to be honest, anyone who had to try to clean it up. The mess at Marathon afterwards could not have been tidied up too quickly, because one of the things, of course, being very different men than yours truly, that we are told that the Spartans wanted to do as soon as the moon's phase, turned correct and they were able to show up too late to fight in the battle, but apparently not too late to see the bodies, and they wanted to go look at the dead Persians in the battlefield. Probably wouldn't mind seeing a good execution or two on the way. Different times, The aftermath of the Battle of Marathon is frustrating from a military history standpoint, because didn't we say earlier that this is an occasion where tactical weapons systems actually impact history all the way up to the really big trends and forces level? But there's not enough information about how this battle went the way it did for you to discern anything. I mean, you want to know how the cavalry is going to face off against the hoplites and how that, weird weapon system anomaly is going to play out. But Herodotus doesn't even mention the cavalry, which is why everyone wonders where it is. Then you wonder about the archery, and is the machine gun archery just going to mow these hoplites down? Herodotus doesn't mention anything about the archery either. The only thing he mentions with any certitude is he said that the victorious wings of the Greek army turned around and surrounded the Persian center. In other words, a double envelopment, which I can't find historians who think, yes, that's likely. In a period where Greeks were better trained and better drilled in the Hellenistic era, you still rarely could have a single envelopment. But historians suggest it's a little strange to think that these citizen hoplites from Athens were able to achieve a double one, especially planning to and then carrying it out. So the one thing Herodotus tells you turns out to not be true. Historians, will play with ideas like, well, the Greeks were victorious because they had a lot more to fight for, which is certainly true. But it's all speculation, and it doesn't tell you anything, and you feel like you waited, through a whole thing for a cliffhanger episode, and then the cliffhanger episode of the show you're watching has a cliffhanger episode at the end. It's a heavyweight fight that ends on a foul, although let's not take anything away from the Greek victory. It's huge. It saves Athens, right? And the Athenians will take such pride in their victory at Marathon that they will continually be reminding Greeks of it for a very long time. Famous playwrights will have it put on their, the equivalent of their tombstone instead of any reference to their, work in the theater. I want you to know I fought at Marathon. The Medes know it. That kind of thing. So it becomes a part of mythology. And not just Greek mythology, but as we said at the beginning, Western traditional mythology ever since. But from the Persian point of view, Marathon may have even just been a single setback on an expedition that had tons of positives. Pierre Briand suggests that this whole affair was a punitive expedition. We burned Eretria. We had most of the area submit earth and water to the great king. So before we left, those places weren't beholden to us. Now they are. So you have one setback at Marathon. Troops we can easily replace. Money, we have more than we need. And by the way, they don't really look like a beaten army when they leave Marathon. We're told that the Battle of Marathon ends when the Persians get on their ships and leave. But where do they go? They don't go home like tail between their legs, straggling, hoping that they're not chased down, and run down to the ground. They go to Athens. They take another stab at getting into the city. Heck, the army's not there. We just lost to the army, so why not sail around, take advantage of our extra mobility, and capture Athens while they're gone? And again, rumors of fifth columnists inside the city saying, now, and shields flashing on the top of mountainsides, who knows? Then you have another part of this story, which is famous, again, from the Greek point of view, where the troops at Marathon go the 25 miles on foot at high speed, faster than you could even expect, and by the time the Persian fleet pulls into the harbor at Athens, they see the army they just lost to waiting there for them. So now they compare the profit and loss column, and especially if Briand and others are right, and this is more of a punitive expedition, it's already achieved the major goals, so now they go home. And while the Greeks, and especially the Athenians, are justifiably proud of defeating the Persians at Marathon, and they should be, I mean, what were the odds of that? You can't help but think that what's happened here now is that they've managed to go from a gnat that was a minor annoyance on a dragon or a giant, and they were absent-mindedly swatting at them with their hand, to something that bit hard enough to get their full attention, and find themselves now in the crosshairs of a man who's not just the king of kings, but he's been on the throne for more than 30 years. He is uber confident. His people, according to Herodotus, think of him as a shopkeeper or a huckster. We thought of him more like a CEO. He reminds me of like a Steve Jobs type character, somebody whose, whole sort of being is infused in the corporate structure. I mean, after 30 years of rule, the Persian Empire has Darius all over it. And now he decides that he's going to lead a bigger, better prepared expedition to Greece himself. If you want something done right, sometimes you just have to do it personally.
If you think the show you just heard is worth $1, Dan and Ben would love to have it. $1 a show. It's all we ask. Go to dancarlin.com for information on how to donate.
I am a notoriously bad topic picker, and I traditionally pick something that I think I can do much more quickly than I can, and then when I get into the middle of it, I feel compelled to do the topic justice, and we end up traditionally with a very long series of shows. Well, what you're about to hear is the equivalent of like a double album by a music band or something. We are essentially giving you parts 3 and 4 of what probably should have been, realistically speaking, a 4-part series on the Achaemenid Persian Empire, with an obvious focus on their wars with the Greeks and the Macedonians. If you missed parts 1 and 2, you probably want to catch those before you catch this one, but there's so much military history in this one, because I knew I'd be crucified if we didn't go into loving detail about what amounts to several of the best battles in ancient military history. So we do that, and we give you what is probably twice the length of what a good hardcore history show should be. So savor it, let it last, and hopefully it doesn't become like one of those double albums I grew up with where you listen to it and you think, God, they could have cut half that thing and just put out one really good single album. The way I look at it, though, this is one of the great topics in all world history. And if anything, it probably merited more attention than I gave it. But as I told you, I'm a terrible topic picker, and I'm always trying to recover after I make my poor choice. So without further ado, part 3, and really part 4 also, the final installment of our series on the great kings of the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire, Kings of Kings, part 3.
December 7th,
It's history.
1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The events.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Would have fighting power.
Not quite to the noise, man.
The figure.
Over humanity.
From this time and place,
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Mr. Gorbachev,
the drama.
tear down this wall.
Gate 6 to Manhattan, urgent. Marine 6. Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know
whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
If we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men.
It's hardcore history.
Earlier, we had posed the question about whether or not absolute power corrupted absolutely, and pointed out that in, the kind of world that most of us come from, it's sort of taken as a given that you don't want to trust a person with absolute power because, well, look at history, right? But look at history. In the story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, if you look at all the different kings, which is what we're doing, there are a number of them that almost certainly had what amounted to absolute power, and several of them, two at least, that didn't just not abuse it, but seemed to, almost be the prototype that you would want in an absolute monarch. Really two different kinds of prototypes, too, because the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, was like the warrior king, his version, his empire's version of it, kind of an Alexander the Great, and probably the greatest conqueror before Alexander the Great, so sort of one kind of ruler, but prototype, right? King Arthur. But then, you get Darius, a king or two later, and Darius is like the gifted administrator, a person who's a genius, maybe, at organization and structure and handling things, from a cost-to-benefit ratio. I mean, the Greek writer said his own people called him a shopkeeper. Huckster is another name given sometimes. But basically, a shopkeeper, as we said in the last part of the program, if the shop is Walmart, you're not a shopkeeper, you're a CEO. And we said Darius was like the CEO of Persia Corps because Persia kind of seemed to almost have like a subcontractor relationship or a subsidiary, a licensed subsidiary of Persia Corps with their various satrapies and provinces. Nonetheless, if absolute power corrupted absolutely, one would think that you wouldn't have a Cyrus the Great, or you wouldn't have a Darius, and they wouldn't have done so well. So obviously there are exceptions to the rule. But those kind of people don't come along every day in any society. I mean, oftentimes the great empires throughout history have managed to sustain themselves, with occasional great leadership. I mean, how many great leaders, must you have show up over a period of 150 or 200 years to keep the empire in good stead? I suppose it depends on the variables, right? The outgoing conditions. If things are pretty stable, you can have a Caligula, you can have a Nero, no problem. But if the barbarians have been smashing at the borders of the empire now for 20 or 30 years, you better have a Diocletian or a Hadrian. Well, the Persian Empire gets off to a really strong start with Cyrus the Great, his son Cambyses, who was probably better than the sources described, that weird, maybe sort of magi king that lasted for 5 seconds, and then Darius the Great, who may have been handpicked by a bunch of other nobles when something weird happened to his predecessor to take over the gig based on competency because he was competent as heck. But then about 4 or 5 years after the Battle of Marathon, which we just talked about, when the Persian amphibious landing force is expelled from Europe by Athenian with some Plataean help, Herodotus gives this passage where he says that Darius is mad and now he will punish the Greeks and he will maybe do it personally. But this guy's in his 60s. And remember, how they say 30 is the new 20 or whatever it is. Well, back then, 60 is the current 70 or older, and he's in his 60s, and he's been on the throne for more than 30 years, competently and awesomely reorganizing the empire and making the structure so strong and interesting. I mean, he's a fabulous, fabulous character, and if you're Greece, you better not overlook what he can do to you when he leads the army in person, which seems to be the plan, but then he dies, which was not part of the plan. What's more, the army that he was putting together to go punish the Greeks now, which we're told involved like all of Asia. I mean, the whole area of the Near East is in an uproar, putting troops together and mustering them. He's just going to squash the Athenians and anybody who sides with them like a bunch of bugs. But then, he faces the big problem for most empires throughout history. There's really only 2 big problems that they face. One is that something will swamp or destroy them from without, an enemy force or another nation state, or that you will collapse from within due to revolt and rebellion. A lot of times the two of them worked together. The Assyrians had to deal with this all the time. The Persians did too, even though the Persians are supposed to be sort of the kinder, gentler Near Eastern ancient nation state. But remember, we're grading them on a curve, and the curve was set by a bunch of people who, if you revolted against them, they would cut your skin off you while you're still alive. And you can go to the British Museum today, stroll over to their ancient Assyria section, and you will see stone reliefs that the Assyrian government paid for and commissioned and, said, you will include a picture of 4 of our soldiers skinning alive that person who was the governor of that city who rebelled against us. For the benefit of anyone who views it who didn't happen to be there at the time, for the next 3,000 years, you could see why all of these ancient empires were so draconian to rebels and traitors, because that was such a huge threat to them. How do you keep people in line when you give them a city to go rule and then you take the army and go back home? What's to keep them from just saying, ha ha ha, fooled you, I'm going to side with the Egyptians now, or I'm going totally free, or whatever? Well, we will do the most horrific things to you if you do that. It's funny, too, if you go to any pre-modern society and you want to see the nastiest things they can do to people, they pull out the really awful executions and tortures when they're dealing with rebels and traitors. You go back to, England, for example, in the Middle Ages. They had one where the first thing that they would do to you is rip out your intestines and barbecue them in front of you. Now, you are alive while all this is happening, which makes this a 3-dimensional experience. You are feeling, smelling, seeing the whole 9 yards. And if they're doing this particular execution, to the nth degree, then they will hang you, but they will cut you down and let you down before you die, revive you, do it a few more times. Then they will tie each of your limbs to a separate horse, and those 4 horses will pull your 4 limbs in 4 different directions. That is called being drawn and quartered, usually reserved for rebels and traitors. The Assyrians had all sorts of things that they did, and collective punishment was the rule of the day. So if you were entrusted with an Assyrian city and your job was to keep it, loyal and all that, and you stabbed the king of Assyria in the back, he wasn't just going to cut your skin off. You were going to get to watch people you loved die in front of you. I mean, there's a reason they call some of those punishments biblical, because it's those eras, right? I'm going to kill your family in front of you, then I will blind you, so that was the last thing you see. Wow. It was a rough era, right? And the Assyrians were amongst the roughest practitioners. But they held together a big empire for a long time that way. The Persians have always been sort of portrayed as an attempt to see if you could get away with leniency. What did we say? Knifing you with leniency, at least compared to the way the Assyrians ran the show, and see if that made people more willing to live under the rule, right? I mean, the Assyrian artwork was so horrific, some of the experts think, because they're trying to tell people, this is what will happen to you if you rebel or try to get out of the empire. If you look at the Persian stuff that has survived, there is no artwork like the Assyrian stuff. The Persians do not have any artwork or reliefs or stone carvings showing them torturing anyone. They actually have Persian officials holding the hands of people that are recognizably foreign. You can date them. You can go, oh, look, they're holding the hand of a Carian there. Oh, they're holding a Pisidian's hand. Oh, that's one of the Saka people. And that is by design. The Persian propaganda, as opposed to the Assyrian propaganda, is that the people who are in their empire like them, that they enjoy being in the empire, that it's mutually beneficial, that it's an empire by choice. We're not keeping you here. You want to be in the Persian Empire. It's good for everybody. As we said in the earlier show, the Persians would often sell that to, nations before they went to war at them. Do we really have to do this? Listen, you join us and everybody will be better off. I mean, that's the way they sold the empire in terms of its propaganda. It's carved in stone propaganda. And they generally, compared to the, curve of that era and that area, were generally pretty lenient, unless, of course, you rebelled against them. We told that story, and story it may be, from Herodotus describing what happened to the Egyptians when the earlier Persian king took over the Egyptians, and the Egyptians had to be punished for mistreating some diplomats. And Herodotus says, and this would be very Persian to do, that all the nobles were gathered, the aristocracy of Egypt, not the poor people who had nothing to do with the decision-making, but those in the upper crust, brought them in and then brought their children in front of them and executed the boys, 2,000 of them, including the king of Egypt's kid, and sold an equal number of girls into slavery. And we had wondered what that sounded like. Remember, that's still a scene in my head. What's the movie scene like that? How do you recreate that for the film? Nonetheless, that kind of collective punishment was not unusual at all, which makes you wonder, if that's what faces you. Let's just say you're the governor. Your name is Ugbaru, and you run a Syrian city that's the Persians have taken over, and they've come and they've signed a bunch of documents with you, and you maybe pricked your finger with blood, and you put it at the bottom of the yes, I will be loyal to the Persian Empire, da-da-da-da-da, and then for some reason, might have had a good reason, who knows, you rebel. And the Persians come back, because what are the odds that rebellious city is going to manage to avoid being recaptured? And then the Persians do something horrible to you and your family. I mean, just, let your imagination run wild. The Persians had a punishment called the boats, for example, or sometimes called the ordeal of the boats, which is hideous. Top 3, always on my top 3 worst execution methods of all time, along with also the death by 1,000 cuts of the Chinese. That was a diabolical one. I always think to myself, by the way, with this Persian penalty, somebody had to come up with this. Somebody invented this. You wonder if they'd be proud to find out, listen, 2,500 years later, we're still talking about it. But the method, supposedly, again, this comes from Greek authors, so who knows, but the method was to get a couple of boats, like canoes or flat-bottom boats or whatever, small affairs, but that fit together. If you put one upside down on the other one, you have like a perfect little compartment. And they would stick the person to be executed in the bottom boat. Then they would put the top boat on top of them, but they would leave the head, the hands, and the feet out, according to these Greek authors. And then they would feed the person in the boat a lot of milk and honey, and then smear it all over their face, and then either leave them in the sun or set the boat adrift on a calm lake in the sun. And sources differ on what was worse, but apparently your face would get covered with insects attracted by the milk and honey. But also, of course, you're stuck in that boat, so you do what nature requires you to do, and the worms and the bugs and everything basically eat you alive. And according to the ancient Greek author Plutarch, writing hundreds of years later, by the way, it took one guy 17 days to die. That's horrific. Who came up with that idea? But if that's what faces you, if your city rebels, why on earth would you ever do that? So I think about our ancestors, and I can't decide if they're just unbelievably badass, or if maybe, our whole concept of what's horrible has been changed by softening times. I mean, the countries that still execute people consider the penalty to be the deprivation of life, right? When you're executed in the United States, in a lot of states, they'll just put you to sleep, and you're being punished by losing the rest of the years that you otherwise would have had. In the ancient world or the Middle Ages, death is not the punishment. Death is the byproduct. The punishment is the pain you suffer on the way to dying. Just getting your head cut off in some of these places, if you're a rebel, is cheating justice. So maybe we who put our executed criminals to sleep, maybe to us the ordeal of the boats is unbelievable, but maybe to the people of the time they would go, I'll take it over being flayed alive. Grading everything on a curve, right? Nonetheless, the whole reason that the Greeks are fighting, right, that they get drawn into a war with Persia to begin with, has to do with revolts that happened in Greek cities on the coast of modern-day Turkey, the Ionian revolts. So you have that, and you think, but it must not happen too often. No, in the next few years, right after the Battle of Marathon maybe, and maybe even tied to the outcome. I mean, the Persians get a setback at Marathon, and all of a sudden Egypt revolts. And whereas the Greeks and that whole Greek world in Europe is like the fringes of the backwaters of nowhere, right? Egypt has been described by a bunch of historians as the crown jewel of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And like their cultural equals in Babylonia, next to impossible to rule successfully. The Egyptians and the Babylonians are notoriously difficult to govern. And part of it is because these are populous societies, these are urban societies with crowds. And I mean, in Egypt, for example, right after this era, there will be lots of documentation about how if you don't pay enough attention to the general public on the ground, they riot and they start burning and destroying stuff. The mob in places like Alexandria, which doesn't exist yet, of course, but, I mean, legendary. Same thing with Babylonia. I mean, there's so many people in such a small area, you got to watch the crowd control a little bit. But also, both those places have unbelievably high levels of cultural achievement, and they're aware of their heritage. I mean, in Egypt, in a lot of places, you have to do nothing but look toward the horizon and see pyramids that are 2,000 years old in this era. I mean, they're almost as old to the Achaemenid Persians as the Achaemenid Persians are to us now. And if you're Egyptian, you're thinking to yourself, who are these barbarians who just appeared on the scene? Look what my ancestors were building in mythical times. I mean, can you imagine what a person in 490 BCE thought about something 2,000 years? Couldn't they even conceptualize something 2,000 years before that? I mean, I don't even think they could get their mind around the whole concept. But then what did they think the pyramids were? Both the Babylonians and the Egyptians had these very well-developed religious hierarchies with tons of different priesthoods and religions, and they were very powerful and influential. Anytime you can speak for God, that's some credibility you can use against anyone. And so all these places difficult to control. And when Egypt rebels, Herodotus says that Darius essentially finds out about it right around the same time he finds out about what happened at Marathon in Greece. And here's the way the ancient screenwriter, showrunner, Herodotus, colorizing history really for the first time ever with personalities and dialogue and, significant plot development. This is what Herodotus writes about it, and this comes from my Purvis edition. And by the way, Herodotus says Hellas when he means Greece or Athenians. He writes, quote, "When the report of the Battle of Marathon reached Darius, son of Hystaspes, who had already been thoroughly exasperated by the Athenians' attack on Sardis, he now reacted with a much more intense fury, and became even more determined to make war on Hellas than he had been before. At once he began to issue commands, and to send messengers throughout the cities of the empire, with instructions to each of them to provide a great deal more than they had provided previously, including horses, food, warships, and transport boats. The announcement of these orders threw Asia into commotion for 3 years, as the best men were enlisted to serve in the army and to make preparations for war against Hellas. Then, in the 4th year, the Egyptians, who had been enslaved by Cambyses, revolted from the Persians, which only increased Darius's desire to go to war, but now against both people." End quote. As we said, though, before he can do those things, this ruler who had been in charge of the Persian Empire in an uber-competent way for more than 30 years dies. Generally considered to be around 64 years old. And in keeping with the mysterious nature of the early Achaemenid Persian kings, history doesn't record how Darius died. That's pretty common, by the way. I mean, the founder of the empire, one of the greatest figures in all world history, Cyrus the Great, nobody knows how he died. He might have died in bed. A natural death, of course. The traditional story is he was killed, his body found on the battlefield, the head chopped off and shoved into a wineskin filled with human blood by a vengeful, homicidal Central Asian queen. But you don't know, right? His son, Cambyses, the guy who gets the first, absolute power corrupts absolutely treatment on the part of the Greek writers, he could have stabbed himself with a sword tip accidentally and gotten gangrene and died. Or it could have been something more nefarious. You don't know. The next Persian king is the one who was either Cyrus's other son, the heir to the throne, or some usurper, some magi from outside the royal line. We know how that one died because the person who killed him by hand bragged about it for the rest of his known days. That guy just died after ruling Persia for 36 years, and his name was Darius the Great. Now, Darius, as a guy who came from outside the direct royal line himself, seemed to have done a pretty good job trying to make sure that the right son got the job and that it was all understood who was going to get it, although the ancient authors sort of allude to some potential problems. Because these Persian kings, first of all, like a lot of ancient kings, don't just have one wife. They have several legitimate wives, And then they often have a ton of concubines. Some of these Persian kings will have more than 100 children. And I always find that funny when they'll talk about, often the Persian kings will put close family members in charge of important things. They had a lot of them. In this case, the potential pool of successors seemed to have only included those of the legitimate wives, and then it seemed to boil down to 2 boys. The first one was Darius's oldest son. The second one was Darius's oldest son born after he became king. This is something that's important, I guess. If you're worried about something to do with the mythical blue blood nature and the religious conception, you're a different guy after you become king, and the child you sire after that point might have something that the one you sired before you were king didn't have. This is kind of the way a logical debate on this subject goes 2,500 years ago, at least. That's the way Herodotus sort of explains it. So the guy who gets the gig is the oldest son born after Darius becomes king. His name in Persian will sound something like Khashayarsa. Remember, of course, that's an approximation. I am multilingual in my ability to mispronounce names from many languages, so bear that in mind. Of course, he's known to history by a different name, and he's probably the most well-known and famous king of the Achaemenid Persian dynasty. He's known by the name of Xerxes. He also happens to be the grandson of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the empire, this King Arthur-like figure. Remember, Darius, the perhaps usurper himself, was smart. We said he kind of married into Henry Ford's family, but now he was running the Ford Auto Company. Well, this would be like Henry Ford's grandson. Darius was careful to marry Cyrus the Great's daughter when he became the leader of Persia. This kid's mom, this Xerxes' mom, is Cyrus the Great's daughter. He is, the royal bloodline of this uber-competent guy, maybe chosen strictly on merit from a select pool of aristocrats, of course, Darius the Great, and Cyrus the Great, a mythical figure already in Persian society. We're told that they based their views on male handsomeness based on Cyrus's sort of design. Whatever he looked like, that's the Uberman. And anybody who's got that kind of nose and that kind of hair, the more like Cyrus you look, the more perfect you are. So this is an amazing character. So to be Cyrus's grandson, let's just say there's a lot of promise in this kid, a lot of hype and high expectations. How are you going to live up to that? Xerxes is also hindered, historically speaking, by the fact that the portrayal of him fits nicely into a couple of different narratives, which are the way this story has always been told. One involves the idea of decline. The other involves the idea of a life cycle where decline is the last stage. Only recently have historians really thrown out, or mostly thrown out, this idea that there's a life cycle of empires, if you will. The idea that once upon a time you have people who are poor and their poverty makes them sort of tough, and the toughness of their poverty and the values and the discipline and the Spartan lifestyle, creates the kind of people who can conquer or amass territory to create an empire, which brings in lots of money and affluence, and then eventually, you'll hit this sweet spot where you have the best mixture of the old rough-hewn discipline values that you had when you were poor, but also the cultural advancements and whatnot that come with some affluence and some leisure time and all that. And then eventually, the life cycle of empires culminates with the downhill slope, what Voltaire called the silk slippers, wooden shoes going upstairs, silk slippers going downstairs. You have the luxury and the affluence bringing on decadence, and the decadence brings on softness and luxury and weakness. And then in this Hobbesian survival of the fittest kind of world, then you get taken over by the new poor people on the block who are tougher and more Spartan than you, who had the values your ancestors used to possess. Xerxes is often seen and often portrayed as the beginning of sort of the rich kid era of Persian kings. The ones who didn't have to earn an empire. They grew up in it, right? I grew up as a king's son, and it's just a little different, right? Sure, they taught me how to ride, and I had to throw the spear, and they made me run 5 miles and do all these things that proved I was tough, but I'm still the rich kid's son. Richest man in the world, son. And the idea of Xerxes' failings are multitude of things, by the way, but the classic stereotype of Xerxes is a guy who couldn't stay out of the harem, loved the women, hung out in the harem all the time, and liked to drink his wine. So he's drinking a lot of wine, hanging out with a lot of chicks, and dissipating, as they would have said amongst the old boxing trainers. Dissipating, weak. The beginning of the downhill slide in the Persian Empire. The decline, if you will, begins, Pierre Briand and others will all point out that, listen, the high watermark of the empire, if we're using the old line way of measuring this, is it expanding in territory or is it contracting in territory? Well, the height of territorial expansion is right around the time Xerxes takes over. And it never will be that big again by the time Xerxes leaves. So who do you blame for all that? Well, historically speaking, it's hard not to look for a culprit. Where does the buck stop in an absolute monarchy? Well, whether or not it's advisors or generals who are really calling the shots, the buck usually stops with the absolute monarch. In this case, that's Xerxes. Once again, the poor guy, deserved or not, gets stuck with the bill and blamed for being the first of the Persian kings